people are in shock. How did a rabble-rousing authoritarian populist like Donald Trump get elected in the nation that invented modern democracy? This is not just another problem. It's a crisis. This is the first of a series of films that show how, if we use the right tools, along with Homo sapiens' greatest tool, the power of reason, those questions have answers. If you watch the entire series, you will learn three main things. First, what are the right tools for solving social system problems like climate change, war, and the rise of hate-based authoritarianism? The second question, what are the root causes? And finally, what solution elements would work to resolve the root causes? This is not an emotional movie with appeals on how we can do better. Instead, it's a nuts and bolts detailed look at the critical problems of our time and how they can be rigorously analyzed and solved if we switch to the right tools. So let's begin our story and take a look at the details of how social systems really work. The further backward you can look, the further forward you are likely to see. Winston Churchill. Over the long course of recorded history, there have been three main types of political systems: tribal chiefs, authoritarian rulers, and more recently, democracy. Homo sapiens, rational man, appeared about 250,000 years ago. Like the other primates, the first humans depended upon the natural food supply of the land around them and lived in small social groups. As these groups increased in size, cooperated together, and invented simple tools like fire and spears, they became known as tribes. Out of this came the first formal political organization. Its leader was the tribal chief. The invention of agriculture is widely considered to be mankind's greatest invention because it separated him forever from all other animals and put him on a unique evolutionary path. The domestication of plants and animals was so efficient, compared to hunting and gathering, that it produced a food surplus and massive population growth. It also brought the dominance of the tribal chief system to an abrupt end. Remember that all through history there have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Always. Mahatma Gandhi. The defining feature of the authoritarian ruler period was the ruling class, headed by a king like Tutankhamun of ancient Egypt, a warlord like Genghis Khan, an emperor like Qi Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, or a dictator like Julius Caesar of Rome. Authoritarianism is rule by the few for the benefit of the few. That requires a class-based society, so everyone knows their place and does what they're told. Using ancient Egypt as an example, there were 8 classes, with slaves at the bottom and the pharaoh at the top. Today we no longer have slaves. We also no longer have scribes. That class is obsolete due to the invention of the printing press and universal literacy. This is the pyramid of power. The goal of the ruling class and its ruler was to stay in power and increase their power, with little regard for the lower classes. There were exceptions, like the Gupta monarchy during the golden age of India, but exceptions are rare. Under authoritarianism, the meek do not inherit the earth. It is the strongest to win in the perpetual struggle for survival of the fittest. Authoritarians are easily spotted because they share several key characteristics. The first is strict adherence to authority at the expense of individual liberty, which means follow my orders. The second is reliance on a constant stream of lies and propaganda. The third characteristic is creation of a constant stream of false enemies, so as to justify the need for the leader's absolute power and the sacrifice of everyone who's not a member of the ruling class. Authoritarians also continually stir up hate towards others, project strong leadership via harsh, iron-fisted, simplistic solutions, justify increased military might in war on the grounds that false enemies are harming us, and they detest a free press. Finally, they are intensely nationalistic and want to make their country great again. Every one of those traits applies to the worm-tongued kings, warlords, emperors, and dictators of the past. Those traits also apply to the slick-as-glass, smooth-tongued authoritarians of today. You can see these characteristics in 20th century leaders like Stalin, Hitler, and Mao Zedong. Turn the page to the 21st century and you see the same characteristics in Vladimir Putin, Recep Erdogan of Turkey, and now Donald Trump. See those three men on the right? If you leave them in power long enough, they're going to do just as much damage as the three men on the left. That's how extreme authoritarianism works, and all of those leaders are extreme. This may come as a surprise, but from a system analysis point of view, none of these leaders are the real problem. None are inherently evil. Instead, they are symptoms of a deeper problem. As we will explain much later in the analysis, don't direct your frustration and change efforts at people like these. Direct it to the system that produced them. The third item on the list, false enemies, is the main strategy. If you can successfully create a thundering herd of false enemies in people's minds, then they desperately need you to lead them to safety.
The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamors to be led to safety, by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. H.L. Mencken.
Hobgoblins are false enemies like Hitler's Jews and Trump's Muslims, Mexicans, and anybody who's not white. This particular strategy, the false enemy, has historically led to a lot of totally unnecessary suffering and death. Human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. H.G. Wells. Ancient Athens was the birthplace of democracy, which is ruled by the many for the good of all. Once democracy was fully established, Athens flourished. Quality of life rose to such a high level for such a long period of time that Athens gave us Socrates and his student Plato, and then Plato's student Aristotle. The work of these three giants of thought laid the foundations of Western philosophy, science, and even religion. In other words, the invention of democracy 2,500 years ago made modern civilization possible. After Athens fell to the Macedonians in 322 BC, the flame of democracy died out for 1,500 years. It was rekindled in 1215 when the barons of England forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. For the first time, the king's subjects had rights the king must respect. The Magna Carta didn't change the ruler, it changed the system. The barons and commoners now had rights that could not be ignored. A new seed had been planted. People have rights. The centuries went by. The seed grew. Homo sapiens, rational man, had used the power of reason to solve another problem. The seed sprang to life with the invention of modern democracy in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. How exactly were the people to rule themselves? That took another 12 years to figure out. The world's first fully defined democratic government, as defined by the Constitution of the United States of America, appeared in 1788. It was immediately followed by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in France in 1789. After that, there was no turning back because the system had been changed. We the people are now in control. The invention of modern democracy was such a beneficial leap forward that it swept the world. Today, 69% of the world's countries are democratic. Under democracy, the meek do inherit the earth. We are continually faced with great opportunities which are brilliantly disguised as unsolvable problems. Margaret Mead. Activism as we know it was not possible before democracy because authoritarian leaders allowed no dissent. But a democracy is a nation of laws rather than a nation of men. In the long run, activists are civilization's greatest heroes. An activist is anyone who wants to change the world to help the common good. They might be a grassroots activist, a writer, a politician, a scientist, and really anyone just like you and me. On the shoulders of the world's activists rests the responsibility for solving the world's biggest social problems, all of which are forms of unnecessary suffering and injustice. Scientists engage in technical progress by solving technical problems, while activists engage in social progress by solving social problems. Peaceful activism could not exist until the invention of modern democracy, since before then, activists could not change the system without resorting to violence. But now they can. After 1788, like a racehorse that's just left the starting gate, the world's first modern activists burst forth and began solving huge social problems that had been impossible to solve before. The worst problem was slavery. In 1800, just as modern democracy was beginning to take hold in America and France, an estimated 3/4 of all people alive were held in some form of bondage, either slavery or serfdom. But today, after 200 years of the abolition movement blowing in the winds of change, slavery is illegal everywhere. In 1981, Mauritania became the last country to abolish slavery. But just because slavery is illegal doesn't mean a person has full equality. Full civil rights do not occur until a nation's laws guarantee equal opportunity for all, regardless of race, religion, sex, and other personal characteristics. In the 1950s and 60s, the ideal of civil rights swept the globe. Activists pushed forward everywhere, like in South Africa, where apartheid had kept 70% of the country locked in semi-slavery. The civil rights movement even spread to India, where 1/6 of the population were known as untouchables. And then there was the problem of colonialism. How can a nation be free if it's owned by another nation? Beginning mostly after World War II, courageous activists led nation after nation to independence, generally with violent revolution. But the struggles of India and its freedom was totally nonviolent. Mahatma Gandhi had read Henry David Thoreau's essay On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. Adapting this type of activism to India's unique situation, in 1947, Gandhi led the movement that freed India from 200 years of British rule without firing a single shot. In democracy, the only rights we have are those we give ourselves. So where do these rights come from? They come from the altruistic work of a long lineage of pioneering activists like Spartacus, Henry David Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. All men are created equal, said the United States Declaration of Independence in 1776. But that was for men. Well, what about women?
Ladies, let me tell you this. There will never be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers. Susan B. Anthony. Women have been trained to speak softly and carry a lipstick. Those days are over. Bella Abzug. I know nothing of man's rights or woman's rights. Human rights are all that I recognize. Sarah Moore Grimke.
The 2 centuries after modern democracy was invented were activism's finest hour. Working together in cooperation, millions of activists solved countless problems like these, either fully or partially. I cannot believe that the purpose of life is merely to be happy. I think the purpose of life is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate. I think it is above all to matter, to count, to stand for something, to have it make some difference that you lived at all. Leo Roaston. But there's a dark secret you seldom hear about, except in whispers. Yes, we solved some problems, but hidden behind that wave of initial success lies a larger group of problems that activism has been unable to solve. There's a clear pattern here. We've only been solving the easy problems. The unsolved ones are much more difficult. But there's more. The impact of the unsolved problems dwarfs the impact of the solved problems. The civil rights problem is about loss of rights, while the war problem is about loss of life. Some of the unsolved problems are so big, like nuclear war and climate change, that they could realistically cause Homo sapiens to go extinct. The unsolved problems are made all the worse by the rise of hate-based authoritarians like Donald Trump, who has no interest in solving the unsolved problems. Trump is far from unique. As many commentators have noted, he fits the wave of authoritarian populists whose support has swelled in many Western democracies. The graph illustrates the surge in the share of the vote for populist authoritarian parliamentary parties across 34 different OECD countries. Peep and Norris. It gets worse. A recent global survey asked this question: how do you feel about having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress or elections? That's the same as asking, how do you feel about having a dictator? Here are the results. The trend is pretty clear. Authoritarianism is back in style. 67% of Russians prefer a dictator to a democratically elected leader. So do 56% of those in India, the world's largest democracy. And 34% of Americans prefer a dictator rather than a president. What this data tells us is that the world's biggest problem today is not climate change. It's the rise of hate-based authoritarianism, because that prevents solving the other problems. From this perspective, history is now running backwards from the democracy period to the authoritarian ruler period. Going backwards will make every unsolved problem on that list impossible to solve, because authoritarians don't want to solve common good problems. They only want money and power. Has modern activism really been born yet? I'm afraid I'm going to have to admit that the answer seems to be no. Activism is still in the dark ages, in pre-science. Something is missing. Something is holding activists back. We can solve some problems, but not others. The stakes are so high, it's like we're in the middle of a Greek tragedy. No matter what the characters do, no matter how hard they try to avoid their fate, they're doomed. It's a sinking ship. Why is the ship of civilization sinking? Where's the leak? What are we doing wrong? If we can answer that question, then we can stop the leak, turn the ship around, and run the pages of history forward again. Then we can make the progress that activists know is somehow possible. Authoritarians are now in control of the three most powerful nations in the world: China, Russia, and the United States. In Europe, the racist authoritarian Marine Le Pen has won 34% of the vote for the French presidency. In Turkey, a national referendum has just changed their constitution from a parliamentary democracy to a one-branch form of government, where the president controls just about everything, including the courts. Democracy is no longer evolving forward, but is devolving backwards to authoritarianism. We have a deeper problem here. Democracy itself is in crisis. It's unable to solve important public interest problems, including the biggest one of them all, climate change. Back in 2008, Al Gore said the same thing.
I'm a big advocate of changing the light bulbs and buying hybrids, and Tipper and I have put 33 solar panels on our house and dug the geothermal wells and done all of that other stuff. But as important as it is to change the light bulbs, it's more important to change the laws. And when we change our behavior in our daily lives, we sometimes leave out the citizenship part and the democracy part. In order to be optimistic about this, we have to become incredibly active as citizens in our democracy. In order to solve the climate crisis, we have to solve the democracy crisis. And we have one.
So what can we do? How can we solve the democracy crisis? Al Gore is one of the most influential activists in the world. His latest project, a sequel to An Inconvenient Truth, will be coming out a few months from now. Here's a clip from that movie.
10 years ago, when the movie An Inconvenient Truth came out, the single most criticized scene in that movie was an animated scene showing that the combination of sea level rise and storm surge would put the ocean water into the 9/11 memorial site, which was then under construction. And people said, that's ridiculous. What a terrible exaggeration.
There is a wake-up call here, and that is climate change and our vulnerability to it. It was true 10 years ago, it was true 5 years ago, it is undeniable today.
But speaking truth to power has not worked. Activists have tried that for decades. Telling people more about the truth of the severity of social problems just doesn't work on the unsolved problems. Why doesn't speaking truth to power work? If we can put a man on the moon and a rover on Mars, why are we unable to solve the climate change problem right here on planet Earth? Why is history running backwards? Why is modern activism not working? Modern activism has a one-size-fits-all approach to solving problems. The first step is identify the problem. The second step is what is the solution? The third step is to promote the solution by speaking truth to power, using civil disobedience, marches, movies, speeches, articles, lobbying, and so forth. That's how activism works. That's how it's always worked. According to activists, the solution to the war problem is treaties, more European unions, and disarmament. The solution to the poverty problem in poor countries is to get the rich countries to fund programs for eliminating poverty, stimulate economic growth, control population growth, and so on. The solution to the climate change problem is to get governments to agree to keep atmospheric CO2 under a safe level, like the 350 parts per million target that 350.org promotes. But history always tells the truth. We now know that what is the solution is the wrong question, because it's just not working. Hundreds of solutions have been tried on the unsolved problems. They have simply not worked. Atmospheric CO2 is now above 400 parts per million and rising. We're seeing more authoritarians lately, not fewer. So what's the right question, the one that cuts through the fog of complexity and slices right through to the bone of the problem? Science uses three main steps to make its greatest progress. First, study the system and collect the data of interest. Second, spot the pattern of behavior that needs explaining. Third, ask the right question about the cause of that behavior, at the deepest and most universal level possible. For example, why do apples fall? Why do pendulums swing back and forth so perfectly they can be used as clocks? Why do the planets revolve around the sun? Or the right question that changed everything, why do objects of any kind move the way they do? The answer was the universal law of gravity and the three laws of motion, which are so powerful they became the foundation for the entire field of physics. For Charles Darwin, the right question was, why did the different species that cover the Earth appear? On the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific, why were the beaks of finches on the different islands so exquisitely adapted to the type of food available? What was the underlying cause of all this perfect adaptation? The answer was the theory of evolution, which explained so much it instantly became the foundation for biology. The story of how chemistry got its foundation began in 1868, when Dmitri Mendeleev looked at the 63 chemical elements that were known at the time and asked, why do groups of elements have such similar properties? What is the underlying cause? Inspired by the card game of solitaire, Mendeleev made up a set of 63 paper cards. Each card had an element's symbol, atomic weight, and its key properties. Arranging and rearranging the cards in an intense 3-day work effort, Mendeleev suddenly spotted a pattern. If the cards were arranged a certain way into a table, the properties in each column and row were similar and predictable. Everything fit together so well that Mendeleev found gaps in the table for elements that he predicted would soon be discovered. When 3 of them were discovered in the next 15 years, with nearly the exact properties that Mendeleev had predicted, the field of chemistry had all the proof it needed to accept the periodic table as correct. It also had its foundation. Over time, Mendeleev's table evolved into the one we have today. Dmitri Mendeleev's question was, why do groups of elements have such similar properties? The answer was that the properties of an element depend on where it fits into the overall framework of the periodic table. Like the frameworks provided by Newton's laws and the theory of evolution, the periodic table gave chemists the high-level, unifying perspective that had been missing, a sort of blueprint of the universe. At Thwink.org, we've tried to follow the 3 main steps for how science cautiously and ever so carefully moves forward. First, study the data. Then identify the pattern of behavior to be explained. And then ask the right question. Thwink.org has been working on the sustainability problem since 2001. It took quite a while to spot the pattern of the solved and unsolved problems. After 7 long years of in-depth research, we arrived at an unconventional conclusion. The right question is not what is the solution, but why is activism able to solve some problems and not others? It won't be easy, but if we can correctly answer that question, then we will have found the cause of activism's fatal flaw. We can then begin to replace that flaw with an analytical foundation, a framework for solving important social problems. After that, social system engineers, better known as activists, can start solving social problems routinely, just as physicists, chemists, and biologists do every day with their own foundations.
There are no right answers to wrong questions. Ursula K. Le Guin.
However long it may take to answer, this is the question that activists need to ask themselves. Given the catastrophic outcome that lies dead ahead if the unsolved problems are not solved, it's pretty easy to make the case that this is one of the most important questions ever asked by our species. That question is where the next film begins. By the way, given the present situation, what do you think is the right question?